Good. Rachel?
Thanks so much, Donna, and hi to everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today we're going to talk about nominating opportunity zones. I know a number of you had joined us for our initial Opportunity Zones webinar earlier in February. This one seems very well timed given some looming key deadlines for nominating opportunity zones, as well as breaking news from Treasury yesterday regarding updated guidance on census tract eligibility, which Zach Patton, my colleague, will talk about a little bit later during our presentation. We at Enterprise have been working hard to make sure that everyone in the field across the board really can remain engaged and informed on what is happening up to the minute, and that we are delivering the tools that you need to do that, and to be thoughtful if you're engaged in the opportunity zone nominating process. And so to that end, I would like to say, please feel free to contact us at any time if you're seeing gaps in information or if you have any questions. Think of us as a resource. And speaking of resources, I just want to note that the Opportunity 360 state mapping tool, which we are going to demonstrate later during the webinar, in its first week was utilized over 4,500 times. So it is something that we had hoped people would find useful, and we are seeing that people are engaging with this tool, and we're getting really great feedback. If there are additional uses for it, or if you've been if you have feedback for us to that end, again, please let us know, and because we really do view this moment in time, the next 3 months where, or I guess not 3 months, but the 3-month period, the 90-day period where opportunity zones are being nominated, as being critical to the overall success of the program over the next 10 years. So it's really critical that everyone feel that this is a transparent process, so that they have the tools they need, and that's really where we see ourselves adding value at this moment. So with that, I just want to go over the agenda really quickly. We are going to do a quick program overview, just because there are a number of people registered today who weren't on the original webinar. I feel like a lot of people are familiar with what the Opportunity Zones program is, but I just want to provide a 5-minute overview, as well as go over some key dates and our best guess around timeline for implementation of the Opportunity Zones program. And then want to talk about really what the role of governors and state CEOs are, and we can talk about you know, what the real opportunity for states are to seize this moment and mold the capital that's going to be coming into the type of capital that's going to be catalytic for the communities and help them achieve the desired outcomes and benefits that they want to see. And we talk about that. Then turn it over to my colleague, Zach Patton, who is going to demo the state mapping tool, as well as talk about the guidance from Treasury yesterday. And then I do want to highlight a few examples from states where we're seeing states put up Opportunity Zones websites, as well as engaging in a public process for nomination, and outlining some of the key factors that they're considering in their process. So how they're setting up their lens or framework for evaluating which nominations are coming back, and ultimately what they're delivering up to Treasury for their final Opportunity Zone nominations. On the back end, we're going to provide, again, some additional resources, as well as allow some time for question and answer. And with that, we can go into program background. Again, this was originally introduced in the Investing in Opportunity Act. The Opportunity Zones concept was developed by the Economic Innovation Group, which is a policy think tank that really shepherded the program through, and the legislation through Congress, and is now has a key role in working with the administration and governors on implementation right now. And what we saw was the Investing in Opportunities Act being introduced in both the 114th and 115th Congress in a bipartisan way in both the Senate and House. What ultimately happened was that it was tagged on into tax reform at the end of last year, so it was enacted through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And really the main premise and main purpose of the Opportunity Zones program is to address the uneven post-recession economic recovery that we're seeing across the nation. So we're seeing some areas that have really regained strength after the recession, but there's still a number of communities throughout the nation that are lagging behind. And what this does is connect private investors to those distressed communities in a way that alleviates some of that friction around private investment and finding the proper vehicles through which to do that private investment. Something I do want to note is that this is a tax benefit. It is not a tax program, so community development practitioners typically think about tax programs, so the New Market Tax Credit Program as well as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. This is different. So even though it has program in its title, it is in fact a individual and corporate tax benefit. And so when we're thinking about how this operationalizes, it's better to be thinking about it in that way and about this really flowing through the IRS as opposed to other parts of Treasury, even though there are other parts of Treasury that will be involved in the process. And I did want to give just a little bit of background about opportunity funds, because that has been a question that we've received pretty frequently. And what opportunity funds are, they really are a new investment vehicle or a new class of investment vehicle that was authorized through the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And what it's meant to do is it's authorized to aggregate and deploy private investment that support opportunity zone property, so the eligible investment outlined in the legislation. And those eligible investments have to be made into opportunity zones. So that's what we're talking about today, is nominating which census tracts should be eligible to receive that investment. And the real innovation around this is that the tax incentive is an alternative to capital gains tax. And so the market of unrealized capital gains right now has been estimated anywhere between $2 to $6 trillion. And so this is additive to any source of capital that we've seen made available for community investment thus far. And so it's an uncapped amount. Really, the market's going to dictate how much of this capital flows to communities. And, you know, the risk-return preference on that capital, as well as what type of assets are invested in, as well as which opportunity zones are invested in. Just because something is nominated as an opportunity zone doesn't mandate that any investment actually has to be made into that opportunity zone. And the pooling of this capital ends up being a really powerful mechanism to lower barriers of investment for individuals that otherwise really wouldn't, both individuals and corporations that, you know, maybe would like to be investing in communities, have an inclination to, they understand the issues around distressed communities and want to help in some way, but they don't have the wherewithal or know-how or ability to execute on those investments, or maybe the amount they can invest is not large enough to necessitate any sort of real vehicle to do that. And so these opportunity funds have promise to be able to create that structure in order to allow for that. And what that means is that we could see community investment scale because of that structure. And fund managers, you know, we're still awaiting guidance from Treasury on both the certification process of opportunity funds as well as any sort of additional qualifications associated with being an opportunity fund. and we'll go into that a little bit more in the next slide. But really, there are two requirements that were outlined in the legislation, and it's been thought about that these are going to be private entities that are going to be fund managers. Community development financial institutions or financial intermediaries that are already operating in a lot of these communities, they may be a good fit for moving this type of capital into communities. But I think you'll also see traditional asset managers, financial institutions create funds both at the national scale but also at the local scale. So I think there will definitely be the majority of these being private entities setting up as fund managers, but also there's the potentiality for governments to become fund managers as well as quasi-government entities. So just something for folks to be thinking about as you get creative around different ways and different mechanisms to move this capital into your community. And here are some key dates, and again, best guesses on timeline for implementation. The Opportunity Zone nominations, the first deadline we're up against is this March 21st deadline. And this is the deadline by which governors either have to submit Opportunity Zone nominations or request a 30-day extension. My understanding is that Treasury now has provided the tools necessary to the states to do both of those things. If that's not the case, please let me know. Just out of curiosity, there's not necessarily anything I could do about it, but I'm just, it just would help us to understand that. But that March 21 deadline is coming up pretty quickly, and if you request that 30-day extension, our understanding is that April 20th would then be the absolute final deadline per that 30 days. So then at that point, it goes to Treasury once you submit your nominations. So based on when you submit your nominations, you're either looking at Treasury approval between April 20th or May 21st. Treasury can also request a 30-day extension on their process to approve your Opportunity Zone nominations. And if you do the April 20th submission, and that gives Treasury to May 21 to get back to you, but then Treasury says, I want to do a 30-day, move it back 30 days, do a 30-day extension, then you're looking at June 18th, just based on business days as opposed to calendar days. If Treasury decides to do that 30-day extension. We do not anticipate Treasury needing that additional 30 days just based on the tool that they've created for states to submit their nominations, because basically it is just checking off a box for census tracts. So there's not going to be a lot of evaluation from Treasury other than, is this an eligible census tract or not? And then after the Opportunity Zone nominations are completed, I think we will see Treasury devote resources to providing guidance on opportunity funds, so both the process for certification as well as any additional eligibility requirements. Following that, or maybe in parallel to that, we will see the rules-making process, which will ultimately result in the implementation, full implementation of the law, which will dictate how the program actually works. We're unclear, and this is for policy folks, we're unclear if this is going to be, proposed rulemaking or interim rulemaking process, and that does have an impact. And so, again, please feel free to reach out if you want to talk more about that, because it has an impact on both public input as well as timing. And then once the implementation is finalized, we will see, the creation and investment in funds. So all that to say, that is our best guess. We think that the implementation will happen the last quarter of this calendar year, first quarter of 2019, if everything goes smoothly. We're hearing that this is an administration priority out of the White House, and so while this might not look like it's being fast-tracked, this is what fast-track looks like. So if anything, this could potentially be delayed and moved back, but in order to maximize on the 7-year tax benefit associated with or provided to investors, funds need to be invested at the end of 2019, and so the longer you move the goalposts back on implementation, it just starts messing with the market, and so that's sort of the incentive to get this moving. And so the role of the governors right now, really, because, again, this is not a program, this is a tax benefit, really on the federal level, submitting opportunity zone nominations is the only formal role governors or state CEOs have. So once you submit those nominations and Treasury approves, for the federal purposes of this program, there's nothing else you need to do. Or can do on the federal level. You are not designating opportunity funds, you're not identifying third-party partners, you're not, assigning contracts. It's not anything like you may see in normal community development programs. And I do want to note that why we say state CEOs is that's also how we're referring to the mayor of the District of Columbia, as well as the leaders of U.S. territories, and so it's just meant to be all-encompassing. So then all that to say that, that even though that is sort of all that's needed at the federal level of states, I think that there's a lot of work to start at that point on local frameworks, local policies and priorities that can be put in place in order to create the ecosystem and sort of drive capital where you want to see capital move. And we could talk a little bit about that in a second. Something that's really, really important is that if the deadline for submitting nominations is missed, so if a governor fails to file nominations by the correct deadlines, then our understanding is that the state effectively is opted out of the program, which means that they will be ineligible to receive any sort of qualified investment, which is investment incented through the Opportunity Zone program over the next decade. What had originally happened was that in original iterations of the legislation, it noted that if a state did not nominate opportunity zones, then Treasury could backstop that and they would step in and make those nominations on the state's behalf. That was stripped out of the enacted legislation, but some governors for a while were still operating under that assumption. And so it is really, really important to say if you're not submitting nominations, then you're effectively opting out of this program. And just want to say also, because this is a 10-year designation period for these census tracts, that it is critical right now to be really strategic and transparent about your decision-making as a governor and engaging the public and being thoughtful about what type of environment will create the impact that you want to see and will allow for the type of capital that's going to be made available through these funds to be absorbed and also complementary to other capital that's in the market for similar purposes. And this slide goes into that a little bit. What we've been saying is that governors should be considering census tracts that are at this nexus of need and opportunity. So as I just mentioned, census tracts that are poised to absorb this private equity capital, because that's really what's going to be made available. It's capital that looks and feels like market rate equity, and be able to absorb it in a way that is going to promote positive economic growth. And obviously that's subjective, but again, that's where I think states have some work to do as far as defining what positive economic growth means, and then also putting into place the different policies and programs that facilitate that. We think that intentional investment is critical, and so aligning opportunity zones with mutually reinforcing state resources, federal programs, local economic development initiatives, and thinking through will this capital align with our long-term priorities or infrastructure investments. And so just like some prompts to think about, you know, if a local priority is retainment of your workforce. I know in a lot of regions throughout the nation, affordable housing has become a huge issue, and as people can no longer afford to live in those regions, we're seeing turnover that's affecting the bottom line of local businesses. So workforce retainment and preserving affordable homes. If that's a goal for your region, can this capital be used to further that goal over the long term? Similarly, how are you bringing this capital out to your rural innovation centers, so campuses that have rural satellites? How are you attracting human capital to those nodes? If you have expansion of public transportation, so fixed rail potentially, especially on the regional level that extends beyond the MSA into suburbs and rural areas, can you be aligning your opportunity zones to go alongside or to complement those new fixed transit lines? Also brownfield redevelopment, that's another thing we're hearing a lot. How can you work with this program to promote brownfield mitigation and redevelopment? And then another thing that I think underpins all of this is just the importance for equitable development and economic growth, and the fact that proactive planning is critical. And so as you're looking at opportunity zones, census tracts, potential opportunity zones, that policies and programs either need to be in place now, or you need to be planning to make sure they're in place, that will promote equitable development and economic growth. And Enterprise does a lot of work on this, and so I just threw in a few resources here. We have a resource center online called the Enterprise Resource Center that has even more information if you're looking for a place to start about what that could look like, but especially around equitable transit-oriented development, as well as how localities are using their publicly owned land to further this. And then there's like some meta questions, some really big questions that I'm going to throw out there in a rhetorical way that I think we're all going to be struggling with, and so I'm just putting it out there for folks to be thinking about, because this is where states and mayors and localities are going to need to be creative around what sort of incentives they put in place and protections they put in place given market response to their communities. So, you know, I envision one scenario in which the market is very responsive to this program and there's a large amount of capital invested into opportunity zones. And so the question is, how do you, in those communities, have programs and policies in place that prevent displacement and also keep the wealth of those communities intact over the course of that decade. So that's one. The second is sort of the flip side of that, where you have an opportunity zone where the market is not being responsive. So for whatever reason, the market being investors, are not making investments into your opportunity zone. What can you do? What additives can you bring to the table in order to incent investments into those communities? So it's double-edged sword, both sides of the problem. And then on the fund side, because all things being held equal, the risk-return profile on the different asset classes are going to look very, well, different. And so if there's a local priority around small business versus real estate or affordable housing versus hotels, if there's a local priority or a desired societal outcome, what tools are available to encourage those types of investments that are reflective of those priorities? So how can you be addressing that risk-return discrepancy between those asset types? You know, again, rhetorical, not easily answered, but I think that this is both the opportunity and challenge for everyone working at the local level over the coming years and months, because we probably need to be really responsive to this pretty soon. Another thing that I wanted to note is that the Economic Innovation Group has developed guidance on opportunity zone nominations, and they have suggested that states need to immediately establish a process for nominating opportunity zones, which we completely agree with. We're seeing states do that, but not all states. And that governors need to be actively soliciting input from mayors, county commissioners, local economic development organizations, and other stakeholders to ensure that those nominations align with local priorities. And again, we really agree with that too. And again, we're seeing a lot of disparity between some states are doing that and some states aren't. And so I think that to the extent that states can be transparent, can have an open process, and can move forward on that very rapidly, they're going to be better positioned over the long term with this program. Also, if you can have a point person or agency assigned to answer questions and handle investor outreach, I think that that's really helpful, because a lot of folks are just looking for a place to get answers. So I'll put that there. And then we're really urging governors to request a 30-day extension, given the news that we heard from Treasury. And you know, I'll let Zach talk about that a little bit more. And Zach, from there, I will hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Zach Patton, and I am the Research Director for Knowledge, Impact, and Strategy at Enterprise. I also lead much of the Opportunity 360 work, which, if you haven't yet encountered, is an approach to understanding and improving community outcomes using cross-sector data engagement and interactive tools like the one I'll be showing you today. We just launched our website a few months ago and have some of our initial tools and case studies up there for you to explore and use. So I would really like to do two things today. First, I'd like to spend a few minutes reviewing some key ideas related to eligibility for opportunity zones. And this is important not only because there is less than a month left at this point for states to submit their designations, but also because, as Rachel mentioned, the CDFI Fund just published some revisions to their eligibility data yesterday that affect about 1,100 tracts nationwide. So I want to walk through those changes with you and talk about some of the implications. And then secondly, I'm going to walk you through our eligibility tool that we published a few weeks ago and that we have just updated this morning due to those CDFI changes to incorporate the new information from the CDFI Fund. So with that said, let's talk quickly about opportunity zone eligibility. So hopefully this is a review for most of you at this point, but there are a few changes that I want to point out. So we know that states are being asked to designate census tracts as opportunity zones, And there's really two ways that tracts can be eligible. The first way is by meeting the criteria to be a low-income community, which is the same definition as it is for the New Markets Tax Credits Program. If you are familiar with that one, you probably already have a good understanding of this one. For those who aren't familiar with that one, a tract can qualify in a few different ways. First, if it has a poverty rate of at least 20%. Second, if it has a median family income that is at or below a certain threshold, and the threshold that you use for that comparison depends on whether it's in a metropolitan area or not, and whether it's in what's called a high migration rural county or not. And I have a blog post that I'm also updating today that talks about these issues in more detail, so I don't want to go into it in the time that we have, but I'll refer you to that for more information about what exactly those mean and how they affect the threshold. And then the last one, which this is new, oh, and I should say that the high migration rural counties, tracts in high migration rural counties was one of the pieces of information that wasn't included in the original CDFI fund data that is included in the set that was released yesterday. And then lastly, low population tracts. This means that a tract has a population less than 2,000 people, it's located in an empowerment zone, and it is contiguous with other non-low population tract low-income communities, which is quite a lot of conditions to meet. And up until, this one is new this week because before the passage of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, which was signed on February 9th, I think, there were no active empowerment zones. The last ones expired at the end of 2016. That legislation retroactively extended them through 2017. And so from Treasury's perspective, that means there are now the possibility for tracts to qualify as low population tracts, which there weren't before. And so that means there are some additional tracts in play that weren't in play a month ago, which is challenging timing-wise since, as you know, you're all trying to finalize your designations less than a month from now. But this change is already reflected in the data the CDFI fund published yesterday and in the data that we used to refresh our tool this morning. And, you know, this is also part of why we're recommending an extension for folks because, you know, the clock is ticking down and this is kind of a curveball. So that's qualifying as a low-income community. The second way that a tract can qualify or it can be eligible for designation is by meeting both of two criteria to be an eligible contiguous tract. And this piece also changed a bit yesterday on a technical level, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but overall the definition remains the same. So it has to be two things. It has to be contiguous with a low-income community that has been designated as a low-income community, not just a low-income community that qualifies as a low-income community or is eligible for a low-income community. The state actually has to designate that tract that it's contiguous with as a low-income community. And second, or I'm sorry, as an opportunity zone. And second, it has a median family income that does not exceed 125% of the median family income of at least one of the low-income communities it is contiguous with. And there were some questions that have come up about does it have to exceed 125% of all of the low-income communities it's contiguous with? Our understanding is that if it passes the test for at least one, then it meets the criteria. So if that's our eligibility criteria, let's talk about what this means in practice. So there are two key numbers that we need to be worried about with respect to designations. Each state can designate, each state and territory, I should say, can designate up to 25% of the low-income communities located in it as opportunity zones. And we know that that 25% should always be rounded up. Previously, we were recommending that people round down to be on the safe side, but Treasury clarified that people can round up, or that they should always round up. So knowing the number of low-income communities in your state not only tells you which tracts are eligible, but it also establishes the maximum number of tracts that can be designated. And then the second number to be concerned about is that of the tracts that you designate as opportunity zones, up to 5% of those can be eligible because they're contiguous tracts rather than low-income communities. So just to be clear, that is not in addition to the 25%, that is a subset of that 25%, and that is also rounded up. So just as an example, and hopefully this clarifies what this actually means in practice for you. If a state has 400 tracts that meet the criteria for a low-income community, that state could designate 25% of those, or up to 100 tracts, as opportunity zones. Of those 100, as many as 5 tracts, or 5%, could be contiguous instead of being low-income communities themselves. So that's kind of how this comes together. So now that we've reviewed the eligibility definitions and kind of how that translates into designations, let's talk more specifically about the changes that the CDFI Fund published yesterday on their Opportunity Zone Information resource page. These had really 3 major changes to them. First, their original data that they published on February 8th, I think it was, didn't account for high migration rural tracts as low-income communities. I think this may have been an unintentional omission because nothing really changed between then and now with respect to the high migration rural tracts, but it wasn't included the first time around. And then it also didn't include low population tracts, since, as I mentioned, at the time there were no active empowerment zones, and so no tracts qualified as low population tracts. So both of those together means that there are additional low-income communities in this data set that there weren't in the original. Secondly, they changed the way they're approaching the analysis for whether tracts are contiguous to accommodate tracts that touch but don't have a shared border. And this was the technical change I mentioned. So the definition hasn't changed, but what they're willing to accept as contiguous versus not contiguous has changed. And I have a little diagram later that kind of illustrates that. And then third, I think they fixed some issues with some of the tracts that they had identified previously as contiguous in their original data, but turned out not to be when they reran the analysis. So I think there are some kind of data quality improvements, maybe. So those are really the changes. Collectively, these changes have some implications for the eligibility landscape, a small but I would say significant one. So there are now 168 additional low-income communities nationwide and with the territories, some of which were eligible as contiguous tracts before, but those are new to the roles of low-income communities. And there are now also an additional 1,007 new eligible contiguous tracts that were not considered eligible before. And then there were 72 that were removed from the list, and we don't really know yet what happens if a state has already done their designations, and some of those 72 were included that were removed, but our recommendation would be to use the most current version going forward, even if that means changing the strategy a bit. So yeah, those are kind of the high-level changes. As far as the implications go, we identified 12 states where this means that they'll be able to designate additional opportunity zones. So I listed those there for you. And obviously, because there's a lot more tracts that are eligible now, this is going to affect nearly every state, if not every state, as far as which tracts could be designated if the state chose to do that. And for some of those 12 states that are listed there, it's just being able to designate one additional tract, but some of them have up to 4 additional tracts they can designate, which in some of those smaller states is a significant increase. So that's really the implication of the changes from yesterday. Not earth-shattering, but not nothing. So just some a high-level overview of the reach of this program, or kind of what tracts are in play. I thought it might be helpful to give you a sense of the scale here. So of the approximately 74,000 tracts nationwide, over 34,000 qualify as low-income community tracts, and there are an additional 11,000 or so that are eligible contiguous tracts. So that means that something like 60% of tracts nationwide are potentially in play for this program. I should mention that those numbers are based not just on the CDFI funds data, but also our own analysis, which I'll mention in a minute. And then once we apply the 25% cap per state, and there's also a special minimum exemption for states with less than 100 census tract or 100 low-income communities, then we get about 8,100 tracts, or about 11% of all tracts nationwide, that are going to be designated in the end if everybody designates the maximum that they can. So about 11% of all tracts nationwide will become opportunity zones, which is a pretty significant share. And lastly, before I jump into the demo, a few technical notes. So on the guidance released by the IRS in early February, I think on February 8th, they clarified that the states can make designations on the basis of 2015 data, which is what the CDFI funds data set are based on, or using 2016 data, which is the most recent American Community Survey data. And I think they also are going to be considering a combination of both of those, because it looks like they'll be evaluating eligibility on the basis of an individual tract rather than the nominations as a whole. So if you use our tool for designations, you'll benefit from the analysis of 2016 data that we have already done for you to determine eligibility, including the contiguity analysis. But as you'll see, we also provided the underlying data there, so you can do it yourself and compare it and so forth. So the second note is that contiguity can, or at least it's possible for, and we've seen some cases where contiguity occurs across state lines. So an eligible contiguous tract is eligible because it is contiguous with a tract that's in another state. And the law doesn't say anything about a tract having to be contiguous with a low-income community in the same state, or an opportunity zone in the same state. And the IRS has acknowledged that they would accept nominations that cross state lines. But because it has to be contiguous with an actual opportunity zone designated tract, for this scenario to happen, it would mean that states would need to coordinate in order to make that happen. And I can see this being desirable in especially metropolitan areas that cross state lines, as an example. And then the last note here is about the technical change to the way that that we're seeing the CDFI fund approaching contiguity. So in the original version, you can look at the picture here. In the original version, we understood that they were going to be using the Rooks case here, which means that tracts have to share a border. So if the dark colored square in the middle is the low-income community, then only the sort of slightly lighter shaded squares that share a border with that dark square would be considered contiguous tracts. But in the way that they're approaching it with this latest release, we see that they're using what's called Queen's case contiguity, which is where the tracts that are, the squares or tracts that are in the corners here also qualify, even though they only touch at a single point. So for those of you who are GIS analysts or work with GIS analysts, this is an important point if you're going to be undertaking your own analysis of contiguity. Again, if you're using our tool, we've already done this for you, but in case you're doing this yourself. So with that said, I'm going to switch over to the second part, which is demo of our tool. So some of you may have seen the tool that we published a couple weeks ago. We just updated this morning, as I mentioned, to accommodate the changes that we just discussed from the CDFI fund. The functionality hasn't changed, with the exception that we added support for Puerto Rico, since some of you requested that. That wasn't previously there. So for those who haven't seen this, we put this together to not only give a more detailed information about the eligibility for any given census tract, but also to allow us to look at how the Opportunity Zone eligible tracts intersect with other federal programs and with our Opportunity 360 outcome indices, which gives you a view into the populations that live there and the outcomes that they are achieving and experiencing. So this tool is live online, so you can access it at the URL you see here, or there's two other ways you can access it. One is through the Enterprise Opportunity Zones program page, which Rachel mentioned. And so if you go to the program page that you see here, you can click on the Access the Interactive Map button, and it will take you there. And the other is if you go to the Opportunity 360 website, you can go to the resources page, and it will be listed on the resources page. I think for now we've also stuck it on the home page so you see it when you enter it, because a lot of folks are looking for this. And in addition to the tool itself, we've also made the eligibility data along with the methods documentation available for download on the page. So you can throw the data into GIS or Excel or whatever you want to do with it, and overlay your own data as needed. So you can click on the links here to download the eligibility data, or here to read the methods. And I'll show you later if we have time what that looks like. So when I open the tool here, go full screen. When I open the tool here, I see a state level map. Since given that the designations are occurring state by state, we thought this would be the best starting point for most folks. And I can use the drop down here to select my state. So if we wanted to choose, say, Colorado, we would choose Colorado, and it will reload the tool with, Colorado, and it'll reload with Colorado as the state being displayed. On the map that you see here, the dark blue areas represent tracts that are eligible low-income communities, and the lighter kind of blue-green color are the tracts that are eligible contiguous tracts. I can zoom into the map if I want to look at a particular location to get more detail, and this is especially useful in more dense tracts or tracts in urban areas because they aren't very visible when you are zoomed out at a state level view. So for those of you working in urban areas, you may have to do a little panning and zooming with the map here. If I mouse over a tract, I can see more information about it. So let's go do one here, including whether it is part of the Treasury Safe Harbor data set, which means that the CDFI fund has it included in their list that they published yesterday, or whether it's still potentially eligible, but you would need to provide additional justification to nominate it. So you can see here, this is kind of a combined status. So we say if it's a low-income community under either of those possibilities, then it's a low-income community here. In this case, this particular tract is in the Safe Harbor data set. It also is eligible based on Enterprise's analysis of 2016 data. So you could see that here, but we could find cases where it's not in the Safe Harbor data set, but it is eligible using 2016 data. And that's when you'd want to turn to the data download that we have to get the data necessary to justify the nomination of that tract. In addition to the type of eligibility, there's also a link here to download, or not download, but view the Opportunity 360 measurement report for this tract, which I'm not going to show you in detail, but if you click that link, it will generate a report like this, and it has 20-something pages of data all about this tract, the people who live there, the socioeconomic conditions, the housing market conditions, and so forth. I'm not going to have time to go through that today, but I encourage you to check that out. There's more information as well about that report on the Opportunity 360 website. So if we go back to our tool here, you'll also see at the top right, there's a box that has some additional information, including the maximum number of tracts that a state can designate. And this number, I should point out, is based on the CDFI fund's official count, because as I mentioned, that is the number that really determines how many tracts you can, the maximum number of tracts you can designate. So you'll notice a disparity between this number divided by 4 or 25% of this number and this number. That's the source of that disparity, because here we're capturing everything we see as being eligible to be designated as a low-income community opportunity zone, and this is just the official count from the CDFI funds data. And then down here you see the breakdown of tracts that are displayed on the map or that meet the filter criteria. And you can see a breakdown of them by how many are low-income communities versus how many are eligible contiguous tracts. So you can see kind of how far or close or far away you are to this maximum number as you apply different filters. And you can find those filters down here. So at the top, there are some broader characteristics that we can filter on. We could zoom to a particular county that we are interested in. We could look at urban versus rural tracts. And you can see if I select just the rural tracts, then the tracts in the urban areas are going to disappear on the map here. And so then as those get filtered, these numbers here update, and I can see how many low-income communities are included in the filter set. Even though we're zoomed in on the map, it's showing us the number statewide, so not just in the window here. Below this group of filters, we've included filters for federal place-based programs. So I can look, for example, at the Opportunity Zone eligible tracts that have received some kind of new market tax credit investment, which is right here. And these are going to be hard to see on the map, so I'm not going to filter them, but I could zoom in to take a closer look if I needed to find them and see more details about those tracts. And the idea here is that we really wanted to give people a basis for identifying other tracts that have been targeted by federal investment in place-based programs, since these are places that may have some experience dealing with the implications of new investments in those areas, and so might be kind of better suited for Opportunity Zone designation. Although this is by no means an inclusive list of federal place-based programs, we just included a selection of major programs here. And then finally, down at the bottom, we see our Opportunity 360 outcomes framework here. And we can filter the tracts based on their scores across our 5 outcome dimensions. So for example, maybe in my city, I want to look specifically for tracts with stronger measures of housing stability because I'm worried that this program could lead to displacement among vulnerable populations. So I might crank up this filter to look only at tracts that have better housing stability so that I can see that these are ones that are maybe going to have a bit more resistance to shocks to the housing market. So whether that's having lower cost burdens or the presence of subsidized housing stock, those will be the ones that are remaining when I turn that filter up. So I should note that these filters won't work for Puerto Rico since we don't have calculated scores for these tracts here, but they will show up for all the other states. If I want to see a list of the specific tracts that meet the criteria I have, so let's say I get my filters set the way I want them, I can go to the Info tab up here and see a list of the tracts that meet the criteria, and then some additional information about the eligibility criteria, the Opportunity 360 scores, and so forth in the text here. So that's a quick tour of the tool itself. As I mentioned, you can also download the eligibility data underlying the tool. So you get a spreadsheet, has an About tab. It has a list of all the tracts nationwide, whether they're in the CDFI Fund Safe Harbor data set, how they fare in our analysis of the 2016 ACS data, and then what our combined determination was for them. And then you have tabs that give you the data necessary to support designations of those tracts that qualify under the 2016 ACS, including the analysis of contiguity that shows you which low-income tracts support the eligibility of a given eligible contiguous tract. And then, as I mentioned, you can also download the methods documentation there on the site. And so with that said, I will turn the microphone back to Rachel to talk through a few examples of how states are approaching the designation process before we wrap up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Zach. And I do want to note that while Zach and I respectively were talking, we were also answering some of the Q&A questions. So I know we're running out of time, running short, but hopefully if you submitted a question, we've answered it. If not, we will get to it and either reach out to you by email or otherwise. So what I want to do with our remaining minutes are go over a few examples where we're seeing states engage the public, create websites, but also there's some really specific things that they're doing which I would encourage other states to contemplate and think about, because I do think it'll be helpful. So one example is Colorado. You can link to their website right there, and you'll be able to access the link once these slides are made available. But in addition to doing a portal with a public input process, they are engaging a number of local stakeholders, including their enterprise zone administrators, and they're also encouraging the public to reach out to local enterprise zone administrators if the public has input that they're seeking, so they're sort of assigning a point person in that way. They also very literally assigned a point person, an actual point person for investors and fund managers, potential investors, potential fund managers that are interested in engaging with the broader ecosystem of Opportunity Zones program once it is implemented. So again, like creating a pipeline of interest, and how they're facilitating that is they created template LOIs for those investors and fund managers to start utilizing. So they're kind of, you know, gaining the background information they're going to need. I think it's going to be really important once implementation happens to have all of that upfront interest captured in this sort of way. The other thing that Colorado did is that they outlined the state priorities for zones. So they're being really upfront and clear with folks about where their priorities lie. And within that, they, on their website, something really interesting that I've not seen but I think is important is that they noted that there's a potential for gentrification and escalated real estate prices associated with making these investments. And that's something that they, you know, disclose on their website as communities look to nominate their own census tracts for consideration. So having that transparency, I think, is very important. In addition to the eligible census tracts, Colorado identified, they created an index of need. So these are areas that Colorado has identified as having economic distress and impediments, where they think that the capital provided through these funds will very specifically be able to address these impediments and distress. And so they're understanding the type of capital that will be provided and saying that this will be important to meet those needs. They're also created an index for opportunities. So saying state programs like their creative districts, Main Street communities, wherever these, as well as you know, local hubs like education institutions, federal labs, hospitals, and economic generators are located, that they are going to be giving priority to those communities. So I think Colorado is a really great example. Nominations in Colorado were due today. So to Zach's point, I wonder what Colorado is going to do based on the guidance that Treasury provided yesterday. And again, another rhetorical question, unless anyone from Colorado wants to reach out to me, which I would love to talk with you. In Minnesota, they're being very forthright in identifying how the public is being engaged, and so they're saying they're engaging their major cities, they're engaging their tribal nations, as well as their counties. So we're getting a lot of questions about how are tribal communities and tribal nations being engaged in this process. Please work with your governors and your counties in order to raise your hand and say, I want my census tract to be nominated as an opportunity zone, because that's the way that you engage with this process. Also, the initiative foundations agreed to convene as part of this, as part of the exercise. So this is, my understanding is 6 foundations, 6 major regional foundations in Minnesota. So they're acting as a convener to to gain this insight and help bubble up information to the state. Also, what we're seeing in Minnesota is that there's points of contact at both DEED as well as Minnesota Housing. So a lot of questions about how does this work for housing. Minnesota is saying, you know, this is an economic development program, but also we're considering this a housing program, and we're being explicit in signaling this by saying we're assigning 2 points of contact, which I think is great. The other thing that they're doing, again, is being very forthright about how they're prioritizing and ranking zones. So here is a list of what they're thinking about, and they're asking, as they're engaging their cities, tribal nations, and counties, to do 1, 2, 3 on these priorities and how they rank within the zones that these counties, cities, and tribal nations are submitting to Minnesota to put forth to Treasury. And then in Mississippi, they also have a public input process and portal that's been established. They have, you know, if you want more information, here's an email address. So a person will be available to answer any questions, which I can't emphasize is just so important to have that contact. And they, again, are being very upfront about how they're evaluating their priorities around opportunity zones. So they're saying submissions are going to be evaluated on population change, per capita income, industrial development, proximity to institutions of higher learning, and regional distribution. There's probably, if you look at the application, you can glean some additional factors that may be included. But the other really interesting thing that Mississippi potentially is doing or could be doing, I don't want to speak for Mississippi, but is that they are looking to their north at Tennessee, and DeSoto County, Mississippi is one of the most rapidly growing counties in Mississippi, and it's actually part of the Memphis MSA. And so based on what Zach was saying around contiguity and sort of regional approaches, I do believe Mississippi is working with Tennessee, and if they're not already, I think their plan is to, and they're engaging DeSoto County in understanding what census tracts need to be put in place in order to really capitalize on that MSA and make that an impactful option potentially. So again, something else to be thinking about, looking across your border as a state and working across lines based on cities that reach across states as well. So I know we're going a little bit over time. I do want to say that those are not the only states that have these public processes in place or have websites up. Here are a few more. If you know of others, please email me. At the top, we also have some additional resources which you can click on once the slides are circulated. And the other thing that I do want to note is that at Enterprise, we have a part of our company called Enterprise Advisors. Victoria Brown is our Opportunity Zones point of contact with Enterprise Advisors. And what I want to say is that she's available to help states and communities think about how these designations and tracts could be used to further state and local priorities. So, you know, it's really important for me to mention that our approach in doing so is going to be unbiased, but we want to be effective, and we want to make sure that what we're providing to you as far as guidance is going to help and assist your goals and maximize the impact that you're going to see in communities to drive action and change. So if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, Victoria is available. And again, if this is not a pitch, it is just an offer for some additional insight or assistance, and just given the short window of time that we know everyone is working with at this point. And with that, Donna, I think we are ready to wrap up.
Great. And just a reminder to anyone who may have not gotten their question answered yet, don't despair. The questions will be made available to our panelists, and we'll have them respond to you offline. And with that, this wraps up today's presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you online again very soon. Goodbye.